Shalom, Dr. Dina Dye here with Foundations in Torah, and welcome to the series In the Beginning. Where I finished up last time, I kind of want to go over it again, and hopefully it makes sense to you, because we were talking about the millennial kingdom. Now, we don't actually find that expression in the Bible, but it is kind of tucked away, sort of a hidden meaning, if you will. But I mentioned this concept of one day, and coming from Genesis 1:3, and it was evening and it was morning, and we generally translate it the first day, but actually in the Hebrew it is Yom Echad. Now, Yom Echad is more than just one day. We're not talking about 24-hour day that we know. It is an idiom, it is a symbol for something much deeper. That idea of Yom Echad is as one day is actually the restoration of the kingdom. It is sort of the kingdom whole. When eternity, if you will, or heaven, the world outside of time, is restored to the world inside of time. And I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks. And that expression, one day, we'll see it manifested on a Yom Kippur, Yom HaKippurim, the Day of the Atonements. But it actually, when you're reading in the Bible, you read a day, that day, the day of the Lord, the day, one day, is all referencing the kingdom when everything is restored and God rules and reigns from the center of the cosmos. And that is essentially what we would call the millennial rule. Hopefully, in light of all this particular scripture will make a little more sense. And that is from 2 Peter 3:8. And you're familiar with it. With the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years. Now, I've talked about in the ancient world, numbers weren't literal. Now, it isn't to say that if somebody did something and it took 7 years to do it, it can have a literal meaning. But by and large, in the ancient world, these numbers were symbolic. So in this case, the number 1,000, which can be reduced to the number 1, has everything to do with eternity, that which we call heaven, or the eternal world, or the restoration of the eternal covenant. So now we would read with the Lord one day, which is Yom Echad, which we saw in Genesis 1:3, is as eternity. Okay, so the concept of the millennial reign has to do with the eternal, and the eternal joining with the time within time to become one entity, one age. This world expressed in Hebrew is Olam Hazeh, the present age, the time governed by the laws of nature. And the eternal world is described as the world to come, or in Hebrew, it's the Olam Haba. That's how they translate it. When those two things are restored as one, when creation is restored, that is, we have entered into eternity. And that is how this is manifest. Yom Echad, 1,000 years, is basically an idiom for eternity. And that would be the restoration of the earthly temple as well as the heavenly temple. So as an aside, and to help you understand the scriptures a little better, like I said, I'm not dismissing numbers, having a literal meaning, but by and large in the ancient Near East world, they have a symbolic meaning. So for example, when you see the numbers 1 or 10 or 100 or 1,000, it is communicating something about the eternal world. So for instance, think about Abraham. How old was he when his seed came forth? The seed that would be out of his loins, the seed that is the king. Let me just mention here, if you follow it back and you read in Genesis 17, you're going to find out that God promises a seed would come forth from Abraham, but is speaking of kings. And it actually says the same thing about Sarah. So from Sarah and Abraham, a seed would come forth who would be king, and out of his loins, kings would come. Now, kings don't come out of regular commoners' loins. They come out of those that are king. And so the picture of Abraham as king, and of course, Isaac is born when Abraham is 100 years old. So again, this idea of whenever you're reading 1, 10, 100,000, etc., we're talking about the eternal world. Now, it is a picture and a type and a shadow, to be sure. Now, when we're talking about the number 4 or 40 or 400 or 4,000, we're talking about the natural world. So we have this world and the world to come. This world, representing the world inside of time, has to do with the natural number 4. That's partly because Think about it. A baby comes forth in 40 weeks. The embryo is formed in 40 days. And there are myriads of 40s in the scriptures, aren't they? As the children of Israel go through the wilderness for 40 years, we see 3 patterns of 40 in Moses' life. We see Yeshua going out in the wilderness for 40 days. All of this are things related to the natural world. And then the ultimate, the kingdom restored, when this world and the world to come are restored, we see that in the language of temple building. So 770, 700, 7,000. So when Israel goes into exile for 70 years, when she comes out, we see this restoration of the house, the whole house of Israel, if you will, or where God is seated on the throne in their midst. So very important as you're studying to recognize this language as symbolic language. Now, from John 17, 20 through 22, it says, I pray not only for these, but also for those who will trust in me because of their word, that they may all be one. Just as you, Father, are united with me, and I with you, I pray that they may be united with us, so that the world may believe that you sent me. Now, sometimes when you read that, it sounds a little bit convoluted, this repetition, but it is about the restoration of the two worlds, and that is the nature of the community of Israel, or the community today is supposed to be one with the Messiah. And as the Messiah is one with the Father, it is kingdom language speaking of restoration of the creation, etc., and that the two worlds will be restored as one and united. And again, it's all about a marriage and about a covenant and coming together and producing new life. And so Yeshua talks about this quite a bit in chapters 15, 16, and 17, again, about the restoration. He goes on to say, the glory which you have given to me, I have given to them, so that they may be one, just as we are one. I united with them and you with me, so that they may be completely one. Again, this language of one, of unity, of Yom Echad, all pointing to the kingdom. That's the kingdom reality. I particularly like this quote from Genesis Rabbah. And this takes it maybe more into a little bit of a mystical realm in terms of temple building. But it says, in the beginning, God created. How do they translate that? That symbolized the temple was built. Now the earth was void, alludes to the temple being destroyed. And God said, let there be light, signifies the temple rebuilt and firmly established in the Messianic era. So the pattern we see in Scripture is sort of this repetition over and over of a whole a house, a temple, and then it's destroyed, and then it's rebuilt, and then it's destroyed, and then it's rebuilt. It's sort of, we see this repeated over and over again because the nature of everything is about the building. Think about it in John chapter 2, when we have the wedding at Cana, and then we have the description of Yeshua at the Passover. He goes into the temple, he overturns the tables because of the money changers. And further down in the passage, he says something very interesting. He says, destroy this temple, in 3 days I will rebuild it. And of course, they're like, well, how's that possible? It took 46 years to build, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. But this is going back to our temple language, our house language, the ruling and reigning of God sitting on a throne. And Yeshua comparing his body with the temple takes us all the way back to the cosmos. Because, of course, he was there even before we have a cosmos created. It's all about the restoration as one. One is significant. And, of course, he talks, and Paul talks about the unity of the body becoming one with the Messiah. All temple language, all about life coming forth. So, kind of in a nutshell, the story of the Bible ultimately is a return to Eden, because the story of the Bible has everything to do with humankind, first human, being Adam, we think. We're not 100% sure on that. I think sometimes we have maybe misaligned the scriptures a little bit. To my mind, I see him as the first human in terms of a priestly representative in the garden. I actually, in my opinion, believe that there were other people at the same time, but we're focused on the garden because that's the temple sanctuary. The garden functions as a temple, and so what do we have? Who do we have serving the temple? Well, we have priests. And so Adam is as if he is a first fruits, if you will, of mankind, even though his name means that. I believe he was a specific person as well, but I believe importantly, he was the priest to serve the people so that they knew how to approach God. That was his purpose and function. And so the story of the Bible again is the return to Eden, the garden, the cosmic rule with the king and the high priest ruling and reigning from the throne. That is the nature of what Gan Eden, or the Garden of Eden, was supposed to signify. The garden was essentially the original design patterned after the cosmos, and it was continually being rebuilt. Yet what you have to understand is in the Second Temple period, for example, you recall we have the Essenes there, and they had it with the corruption that was going on in the Second Temple. They just wanted to get out of Dodge and head out to the Dead Sea area and create their own community. And they, in fact, built a community with a similar design as Jerusalem. They called it the New Jerusalem. And so their desire, their heart's desire was a return to Eden, to the garden paradise, to the place that was uncorrupted, because they were comparing what that must have been like with the corruption that was in the Second Temple. And of course, that's a whole nother topic, but that was their heartbeat. And so we see language of the garden in a lot of different places in the Bible, don't we? And particularly, we see it in Revelation. If you remember, there's a lot of garden language that is spoken of in the book of Revelation, the return. They saw that as the pure temple, the one they wanted to return to. And we see the whole construct of the temple from the garden to the Ark of Noah. In fact, the Ark of Noah was a temple. We see it with the tents of the patriarchs that represented the temple, because ultimately it was the place of the presence of God. And from the tents of the patriarchs, we move into the tabernacle period in the wilderness, the temporary throne of God on earth in the wilderness. And from the tabernacle to the first temple, and from the first temple to the second temple, and ultimately to the Messiah, speaking of his body as a temple, and ultimately to the temple of his people, the sons of God. Now, again, I want to emphasize that two things can be true at the same time. We have a tendency in the West and in our modern sort of Greek-type thinking to have something be in this box or that box, and it doesn't have to be in a box. They both can be true. And we see this is quite true when we're talking about the temple. So yes, it can be a physical building. Yes, it can be the cosmos. Yes, it can be the garden. And yes, it can be the community of Israel and the believers and the sons of God. It can be those things. So one does not take away from the other. Now, I'd like to read a quote, which I find profound, and I think probably sums up best what I'm trying to communicate here. This is from a guy named Cosmas Indicopletus from something called the Christian Topography. And he says, "Since therefore it had been shown him how God made the heaven and the earth, and how on the second day he made the firmament in the middle between them, and thus made the one place into two places, so Moses, in like manner and in accordance with the pattern which he had seen, made the tabernacle into two, an inner court and an outer." Doesn't say courtyard there, but that is the nature design of the temple, would have an inner courtyard and an outer courtyard. And then between the two would be this curtain, this barrier, so where one could pass through the other. Now, in the Second Temple, for example, we had the men of Israel, we had the Levites and the priests all serving there. But you could only, depending on who you were, you could only go to certain places. You were always ascending when you went to the temple, but there were areas where you weren't allowed to go. So the men of Israel clearly not allowed to go into the holy place. And only the high priest, again, could go into the Holy of Holies. The Levites couldn't go in there. Everyone had their purpose and function to bring order and stability to that institution. And so you just couldn't go willy-nilly wherever you felt like. And so this is that idea of the inner and outer courtyard was established based on the principle of the cosmos, in which there was the inner sanctum of the entirety of creation, and that would be the Holy of Holies in heaven, the world outside of time, and this barrier between those two things. And so, again, when they're restored, we would see the restoration of the kingdom. So another interesting thing that Cosmas Indicopletus said was that creation was in the shape of a rectangle. I found that to be fascinating. Now, can we prove this? We can't. But there's a reason he came up with that. Now, if you think about it, Remember, Noah's Ark actually was in the shape of a rectangle. And you'll find that the temple building itself, especially from the holy place to the Holy of Holies, is also in the shape of a rectangle. Of course, that's what he said. He said that creation was constructed like a huge tent. And if you read through the Psalms, Psalm 103, 105, 78, and some of the others, talks about this tent in heaven where the bridegroom will come forth. So clearly the ancients saw that the temple, the heavens, looked like a tent because it represented the house of God. It tells us that Moses was commanded to build a tabernacle so it looked like a copy of the whole of creation, and that he saw creation divided into two, this world and the world to come, and a firmament in between. He saw that one part was visible to the human eye and that the other was concealed behind the curtain. Okay, and that the firmament acted as that barrier, and then the pattern came into the tabernacle. So remember, only Moses could go behind the curtain and meet God face to face, if you will. And it is interesting that the expression face to face is also used of Yom Kippur, face to face. And so the high priest would come into the Holy of Holies, that's the picture, face to face with God, although there was a cloud between them. But that was the idea of the concealed world was concealed behind the two curtains in the second temple and in the Holy of Holies. And so the outer part of the tabernacle represented the visible world, and the inner part of the tent of meeting was the invisible world. So you see that connection there. Here's another quote. This is from the Clementine Recognitions. It says, "In the beginning, when God made the heaven and earth as one house, he divided into two portions that fabric of the universe, although it was but one house, that the upper portion might afford a dwelling place to angels and the lower to men." Very interesting. So he's also confirming that we have this idea of the one house, that they're separated, heaven and earth, and they're divided with the firmament in between. And the goal of the restoration of creation is that we return to that one house, and that the upper portion, or heaven, was a dwelling place for angels. Now, when we read in the book of Revelation and we see this angel did this and this one did that, the angels are really the priests functioning in the temple in heaven. And in the apocalyptic language, we'll see a lot of times that men are described as, in particular, as animals and rams and goats and things like that. So that's talking about the temple on earth when we see men are described as varying animals. So it's very interesting. Even these early Christian writers saw this pattern. Now, somewhere along the line, we kind of went off the rails and forgot about all this. But and we, at our own peril, dismiss all the ancient way of thinking. Again, we need to try to understand that, and then we can make application for ourselves today, because the Bible certainly meets our needs in every way. It's designed for that. It's really an amazing book, the levels and layers. So, separation is the process of creation. Creation is basically described as separating elements. The term that we use, the Hebrew word is kedushah, and now you might recognize the word kadosh, which has the same meaning, to separate elements. Now we translate it as holiness, and of course to be set apart from the common or whatever. The problem is that we have a sort of a skewed view of what holiness is. So we think of holiness as somebody who's super righteous, and it really has nothing whatever to do with that. It is simply the separation of two elements so that when they come together, they would produce life. So in the temple, there are layers and levels of holiness. That's one level would be separated from another, and of course you were always ascending. When you, even coming up to Jerusalem, you were ascending, and from Jerusalem, as you went up to the Temple Mount, and from the Temple Mount you would ascend through the various courtyards and through the gates and the doors, always going up. But each courtyard and gate and door, etc., had this measure of holiness. That is, they had a separating element to them. So, for instance, the Levites as I mentioned earlier, they couldn't go into the holy place. That was forbidden because they had a function and purpose in another area. So it's not about being righteous. It's about making a distinction between the holy and the common. It is very interesting to me, and except for one place in the Bible, no person is really called holy. Now we'll talk about his holy ones, but really everything that's referred to as holy is referring to something in the temple. Of course, God is holy. All the temple vessels are holy, and the garments are holy, and the furniture is holy, and the celebrating of the festivals, those things are holy because they are set apart from the common, because they have a purpose and a function. So ultimately, the mystery of the universe is how two become one. And they become one by first separating. That is the whole pattern of creation. And that's everything you will see in Genesis chapter 1 until we close out that chapter and move into chapter 2. And now we're talking about the Shabbat, restoring all those things and becoming one once again. So this Kedusha, this holiness, is separating for purpose and function again. When they are set apart, when two elements are set apart, there are certain restrictions or limitations attached to it, and that's very significant. You could argue then that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was holy because it was set apart, it had a function, and there were restrictions and limitations placed on it. What was that limitation? Well, they were not to eat the fruit of that tree. So the tree in itself, we tend to think of it as like it's some wicked, evil tree, but that's not the case. Because trees in the midst of the garden is definitely ancient Near East language. In fact, in the ancient Near East world, in their temples, they had something called the cosmic tree. And that was usually only one tree. We don't see in the ancient world two trees. But this particular tree, the tree of knowledge, was set apart and it had limitations placed on it. So anything that's declared holy has limitations and restrictions. And again, all of this is speaking of temple language. So we see that going back to the concept of in the beginning isn't about a chronology. It's about two houses that were separated that will become one and be restored. That is the nature of all of it. And so the model then is of the feminine and the masculine, that they are separated in the same way. Think about Chava. So I know the Hebrew word there for when she is separated out from Adam's, now we translate it rib, which it could be a rib because Selah is a rib. However, the root word sel has more to do with the side, and I think in particular shade or shelter. So Eve, Chava, was created in the image of Adam in the same way Adam was created in the image of God. She was created out of his side or out of his shelter or out of his shade. And so she is separated out in order for the two to join together in order to create. That was her purpose and function. So creation, the creation process, the mystery of creation is the separating of male and female elements in order for them to join together and that the two would become one. And that is the nature of the Shabbat, the Sabbath rest. We see that fulfilled. So restoring creation could be translated as restoring marriage. And now we understand why the enemy has gone full bore after marriage. If he can restore the image of God and he can restore if he can destroy the image of God and he can destroy marriage, he's won. And so every time a marriage is restored, it is as though creation has been restored. This is the very heart of God. And so, I recognize there's problems and issues and things some of us can't resolve, but the heart of God is that the two become one and produce life. And he is all about the restoration of the family. That it goes out to the cosmos, but it comes down to the very essence of who we are as humankind, and that is to produce a family. So we need to we have made a covenant in a marriage relationship, and we need to do our level best in that context. And I'm not addressing all the different issues and things that come forward. I understand that, but I do understand when there is restoration in the heavenly realms of a family, things things have been restored in the heavenly sense, and I mean on the earth, in the earthly realm, when things are restored, it has an effect in the heavenly realms. And I do think that a lot of the sort of cataclysmic events and things we're seeing is a result of the breakdown of the family. The family is the most basic element of creation and the kingdom. And when it's destroyed, and the enemy knows exactly how to do it, one of the first ways he does it is by taking the father out of the house. When he does that, the rest of the family collapses. Now, can some, a single mom raising kids, I'm not making a judgment call on that, but this is the reality. This is how God designed it. It's very difficult for her, and she certainly needs help and our prayers and us, and we need to serve women in that situation. But that is the goal of the enemy, is take the father out and cause the family to be destroyed. And we're seeing that all around us. It's interesting. Now, this is, I don't normally like to use these sources too much. This is from the Zohar, which is a much later writing. This doesn't take us back to Second Temple time, but it says the blessing rests only where a man and a woman are found together. And interesting, because that has everything to do with temple language and temple completion language and restoration. So I just want to encourage you. I just want you to see things differently than you have in the past. I want you to see the pattern in Genesis and how that pattern runs all the way through the Bible, and how Yeshua came to restore all that and to make that which is separate whole so that it can produce life. It is the very nature of God to reproduce, and that is what he pours into man and woman in order to reproduce after their own kind. And that is, of course, true of the spiritual side of things. We can't separate out the physical from the spiritual. They need to join together and become one as well. So hopefully this has all made sense, and I will pick it up next time. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.